My name is Josephine Amaro. Everyone calls me Jo. I am 40 years old, and for 3 years, I lived in a converted dining room that had a hospital bed in it instead of a table, and I learned things about my own strength that no classroom or job ever taught me. I want to start with a number, because I think it is the fairest way into this story. 1,142 days. That is how long I lived in my father's house, providing his daily care before he died. I did not count them as they passed. I counted them afterward, once I understood I would need to, sitting at a kitchen table with a calendar app open, going backward 1 month at a time. I am not a nurse. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story because my 3 siblings are. My brother Desmond is a critical care nurse. My sister Priya is a nurse practitioner. My youngest sister Ren works in hospice care, which, when you hear the rest of this, you may find as strange as I still do. 3 medical professionals. And the one who left her job, moved into our father's house, and managed his decline for 3 years, was the daughter with a marketing degree who could not tell you the difference between a catheter and a cannula before any of this started. I learned. I want to say that clearly, because it is the whole point. I learned everything, on the job, alone, because none of the 3 people who had the training were in the room. 4 years after my father died, I sat at a conference table in an estate attorney's office, across from all 3 of them, and my sister Priya looked at a letter from the state and smiled, actually smiled, and said the sentence I am going to spend the rest of this video walking you through. She said, "Well, I guess 3 years of freeloading finally caught up with you." Welcome back to Evelyn's quiet table, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you have ever given everything to someone and watched the people who gave nothing get to judge how you gave it, pull up a chair, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and be sure to subscribe. I need to take you back to the beginning, to the phone call that started all of it, because none of what happened at that table makes sense without it. Decliculp Dawn-eyed too. The phone call. No, my father, Salvatore Amaro, was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition. In the spring I turned 36. Parkinson's, complicated within 18 months by a form of dementia his neurologist called. Carefully, not uncommon at this stage, but faster than we would like. The call about the diagnosis went out to all 4 of us on a Tuesday evening. I remember exactly where I was standing, in my kitchen, holding a wooden spoon, when my father's own doctor, at Dad's request, called each of us individually to explain what was ahead. I hung up and I called my siblings within the hour, one at a time, because I wanted to talk about a plan. Desmond, working 3 12-hour shifts a week in a cardiac ICU 3 states away, said, "Joe, I love Dad, but I genuinely cannot uproot my life. I will help with money." Priya, a nurse practitioner with a husband and 2 young kids and a practice she had spent a decade building, said something almost identical. "I can consult on anything medical remotely anytime, but I cannot be there physically, you understand." Ren, the hospice nurse, gave me the answer that I have turned over the most times in the years since, because I think it is the one that reveals the most. She said, "Joe, honestly, I see this all day at work. I do not know if I have it in me to do it for my own father, too. I would burn out. I think somebody who is not already doing this professionally might actually be in a better position, emotionally, to be present for it." I remember thinking, at the time, that this made a kind of sense. I remember not noticing, until much later, that what she had actually said was, "I have the skills and I am declining to use them on the person who needs them most, and I am framing that decision as a favor to him." I was working in marketing for a regional furniture chain. I had no medical training, a 2-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from my father's house, and a boyfriend I had been with for 2 years who, when I told him what I was considering, quietly and without cruelty ended things 3 weeks later, saying he did not see a future that involved this much caregiving in it. I moved into my father's house in September. I gave notice at my job the following week. I want to describe that week honestly, because I think people imagine a decision like that arrives as a single act of nobility, and it did not. It arrived as a series of small, terrified logistics. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad, doing math I did not want to do. I had $11,000 in savings. I had a 401k with about $31,000 in it, which I would eventually cash out at a significant tax penalty in year 2 when the savings ran dry. I had a 2-bedroom apartment lease with 4 months left on it, which I broke, eating the fee, because there was no way to manage a father in decline from 40 minutes away while also paying rent on an empty apartment. My manager at the furniture chain, a woman named Carla, who I had worked under for 6 years, took me to lunch on my last day and said something I have thought about often since. She said, "Joe, I want you to know, most people talk about doing something like this. You are actually doing it. I do not know if that makes you brave or foolish, and I mean that as a genuine compliment to both possibilities." I did not feel brave. I felt like someone stepping off a ledge because the alternative, watching my father manage alone, was simply not survivable to imagine. Detweckeld.Delhi 3. What 1140? What days actually looked like. Well, Del, I do not think people who have not done this work understand its actual texture, and I want to give you some of it, not for sympathy, but because it matters later, at the table, when somebody who has never done it gets to decide what it was worth. The first year, Dad was still largely independent and my job looked like management. Medication schedules, doctor's appointments, driving him places once his license was revoked, cooking meals around a shifting list of what he could safely swallow. I learned to recognize the early signs of a fall risk day just from the particular way he walked from the bedroom to the kitchen in the morning. The second year it became physical. I learned to transfer him from bed to chair without hurting either of us. I learned how to change bedding with someone still in it. I learned from a home health aide who came twice a week and took pity on my obvious ignorance, how to manage a catheter, how to recognize a UTI before it became a hospitalization, how to give an injection without flinching. I learned all of this from YouTube videos, from the twice-weekly aide, and from 3 phone calls to my siblings that I want to describe specifically, because they are the reason the word freeloader landed the way it did years later. The first was to Desmond, at 2 a.m., after Dad had fallen in the bathroom, and I could not get him up alone. I called Desmond because he was a nurse and I was terrified, and did not know if I should call an ambulance. He talked me through an assessment over the phone, from 3 states away, in his tired night shift voice, and then he said, "You have got this, Joe. Call me if he does not improve by morning," and he went back to sleep. The second was to Priya, about a medication interaction I was worried about. She looked it up, told me it was fine, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that she had a soccer game to get to for her daughter. I remember feeling, in that moment, a loneliness so specific it had a taste to it. The third was to Wren, near the end, about whether it was time to call in hospice formally. She walked me through it clinically, professionally, correctly, and then said, "You are doing an amazing job, Joe. I could never do this." And I remember thinking, even then, half drowning in exhaustion, that this sentence was doing something strange. It sounded like a compliment. It functioned as a permission slip for her own absence. The third year, my father needed help with nearly everything: feeding, bathing. There were nights I slept on a cot beside his hospital bed because leaving him alone for even a few hours had become unsafe. I lost, over those 3 years, most of my savings, all of my retirement contributions, and a body of professional experience that, when I eventually tried to re-enter the workforce, had gone completely stale. I do not regret it. I want to say that plainly, before I tell you what happened next, because I think it would be easy to hear this story and assume I am building toward regret. I am not. I would do every single one of those 1142 days again, exactly as they happened, for exactly the same man. There is one night from the second year I have never told anyone about, not even Wren, and I want to give it to you now, because I think it explains something about why I never once called any of my siblings to complain. It was a Tuesday in February, around 3 a.m. My father had become disoriented, a common feature of the disease by that stage, and he did not recognize me. He asked, repeatedly, over the course of about 40 minutes, where his daughter Josephine was, growing more agitated each time I told him I was her. At some point, exhausted past the edge of what I thought I could bear, I sat down on the floor of his bedroom, out of his eye line, and I cried in a way I had not allowed myself to since I moved in. Not loudly. Just a steady, silent leaking, the kind that happens when a body simply cannot hold anything else. I did not call anyone. I remember looking at my phone, at the contact list, at Desmond's name and Priya's name and Wren's name, and I remember deciding, consciously, not to call, because I had already learned by that point, roughly a year and a half in, exactly what those calls would yield. A tired voice offering advice from 3 states away. And then, within a few minutes, the conversation turning gently back toward their own evening, their own kids, their own soccer game. I did not call because I had already priced the calls, and I knew what they cost me afterward, which was the specific compounding loneliness of reaching for someone and being handed information instead of presence. I sat on that floor until my father settled, near dawn, and then I made coffee and I went back to work, because there was no other option available to me. But I want you to hold the shape of those years in your mind, because in about 4 minutes, you are going to hear my sister call them worth 0. Debogel doggy 4. What my siblings believed. While I diddy dable doggy, here is the part that took me the longest to fully accept, because accepting it required me to stop making excuses for people I loved. Somewhere around the 18-month mark, I was removed from the family group chat. I do not know the exact date, because I did not notice immediately. It was a chat called Amaro Fam that had existed for years, mostly used for birthday coordination and the occasional family photo. 1 week, I was in it. At some point after that, I was not, and nobody told me, and I only discovered it when Priya's daughter's graduation came up in conversation at a doctor's appointment, and I realized I had never heard about it at all. When I finally asked Priya about it, months later, on the phone, she said, "Oh, I think that must have just been an app glitch. We should have caught that." I did not push it, because I did not have the energy to push it, and because some part of me suspected it was not a glitch and did not want the confirmation. I found out secondhand, from an aunt, roughly 2 years into my father's decline, what my siblings had been telling the extended family about my situation. The story, as it had apparently circulated for months before I heard any version of it, was that I had moved in to be near Dad's assets and was positioning myself for the house. I want to sit with that accusation for a moment, because I think its cruelty is actually in its efficiency. It took the single most exhausting, unpaid, unglamorous thing I had ever done with my life, and it recast it, in one sentence, as a scheme. It did not require anyone to lie outright. It simply required nobody to ask me a single question about what my days actually looked like, and to fill that silence with the least generous possible explanation. Not one of my 3 siblings, in 3 years, ever once offered to take a weekend so I could leave the state and see friends. Not one of them ever sent so much as flowers when I mentioned, on one particularly bad call, that I had not slept more than 4 hours a night in 11 days. What they did instead, in the space where support should have been, was build a story about me among people who were never in the room to check it against reality. I want to tell you about the one time I actually asked for relief directly, because I think it is the clearest single window into how this dynamic worked. I had not left the state of my father's residence in over 18 months. A close friend from college was getting married 4 hours away, and I badly wanted to go just for the weekend of the ceremony itself. I called a family meeting, over video, all 4 of us, the only time in 3 years I organized something so formal. I laid it out plainly. I needed 1 weekend, just 1. I had already arranged a home health aide to cover the days, but overnight coverage required a family member, given Dad's fall risk and confusion after dark. And the aid agency did not offer overnight staffing on short notice at a price I could afford on my dwindling savings. Desmond said his shift schedule that particular week made it impossible, which may well have been true. Priya said she had her daughter's recital that same weekend, which also may well have been true, Ren said, and I remember this precisely. Joe, I would, but overnight coverage for someone at Dad's stage is genuinely a specialized skill. It is not really a favor you can just call in from someone without the training. I sat with that sentence for a long time after the call ended. Ren was a hospice nurse. She had, by her own account, exactly the training required. She was not declining because she lacked the skill. She was declining because providing it, even for 1 weekend, meant stepping into the reality I had been living in for 2 straight years, and she had already told me, in the first phone call after the diagnosis, that she did not think she had it in her to do that for her own father. I did not go to the wedding. I sent a gift and a card, and I stayed home, and I did not ask again, because I understood, finally and completely, exactly what the answer would always be. Jacoldiel 5. The Piscison, the deed, and a law I did not know existed to Jacoldiel about 14 months before my father died. His primary care physician, Dr. Adeze Nanamdi, asked to speak with me alone after an appointment. She said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Josephine, I want to ask you a direct question, because I think somebody should have asked it a long time ago. Has anyone talked to you about the caregiver exemption? I said no. I had never heard of it, she explained, and I am going to explain it to you now the way she explained it to me, because I think it is the single most important piece of information in this entire story. And almost nobody in this specific situation is ever told it exists. Medicaid, in most states, has a rule called estate recovery. If a person receives Medicaid benefits, particularly for long-term nursing facility care, the state has the right, after that person dies, to file a claim against their estate to recover what it paid out. This is why families are so often told correctly that a parent's house may need to be sold after death to satisfy a Medicaid claim. But there is an exception built into federal Medicaid law, and it is specific. It is sometimes called the caregiver child exemption, if a host holds the book. If an adult child lived in the parent's care for at least 2 years immediately, before the parent would otherwise have required nursing facility placement, that home can be transferred to that adult child, penalty-free, the way the host holds the book, without triggering the Medicaid transfer of assets penalty that normally applies to gifts made shortly before applying for benefits. The reasoning behind the rule, Dr. Nanamdi told me, is straightforward once you hear it. The caregiving that adult child provided is understood by the law itself as having delayed or prevented the far more expensive alternative, which is professional nursing home placement paid for by the state. The exemption is not a loophole. It is the government's own acknowledgement that unpaid family caregiving has real, quantifiable value, and that value is priced specifically at the house. She told me 4 things I would need if I ever wanted to use it. A letter from a physician attesting that my care specifically delayed the need for nursing facility placement. Proof of residence in the home for the 2 years immediately prior, some form of documented care log, and critically, the deed itself would need to actually transfer into my name while my father was alive, not simply be promised in a will. I asked her why she was telling me this now, so specifically. She said, because I have watched this exact situation happen to other families, more than once, and the caregiving child almost never finds out about this rule until after the parent has died, when it is often too late to arrange the deed transfer. I did not want that to happen to you. If you have ever done the hardest, most invisible work in your family and had it priced at nothing by the people who were never in the room, subscribe and stay with me, because what Dr. Namdi told me next is the exact reason this story has the ending it does. I want to be honest about what I felt hearing this. It was not relief, not yet. It was something closer to fury, because the existence of this rule meant that my exhaustion, the 1,142 days, had a name and a value in the eyes of the federal government, and none of the 3 medical professionals in my own family. People whose entire careers touched Medicaid and long-term care policy had ever once mentioned it to me. I asked Priya about it directly, on the phone, about a month later, in a moment of hope that she might actually know something useful. She said, vaguely, "Oh, I think I have heard of something like that. It is pretty niche though. I would not get your hopes up." She had heard of it. She did not tell me it applied to me. Dogeffel dal dal 6. 14 moves of paper, Dogeffel dal dal I, spent the next 14 months, alongside everything else, building the file, because Dr. Nanamdi had given me a map, and I was not going to let it go unused. She wrote the physician's letter herself, updated and re-signed twice as my father's condition changed, stating plainly that my daily presence and care had allowed him to remain in his home, well past the point his condition would otherwise have required facility placement. I kept a care log. I did not do this cleverly or strategically at first. I started it because a home health aide suggested it as a practical tool, a simple daily notebook of medications given, incidents, meals, mobility. It was only around month 8 of keeping it that I understood it was also simultaneously becoming legal evidence. I gathered proof of residence. My mail forwarded to the house. My car registration updated to that address. A utility bill in my name because I had taken over paying the electric once my own income ran out. And I initiated the deed transfer. This is the part I want to be most honest about, because I know how it sounds. I asked my father directly whether he would be willing to transfer the house into my name while he was still alive. Explaining the exemption to him exactly as Dr. Namdi had explained it to me, he cried. "Not from sadness," he said, "and I remember this precisely, Joe. I have been trying to figure out for 2 years how to make sure they cannot just take this away from you after everything, and I did not know how. Yes, do it now, while I can still sign my name properly." I want to walk through those 14 months honestly, because I do not want to make them sound like a simple checklist when they were, in practice, the hardest administrative labor of my life, stacked directly on top of the hardest physical labor of my life, done at 11 p.m. After Dad was finally asleep, at a kitchen table, with a laptop that was 3 years old, and prone to freezing at the worst possible moments. Getting the physician's letter right took 2 drafts. Dr. Nanamdi's first version, she told me candidly, was written in careful medical language that she worried a Medicaid reviewer unfamiliar with the specific exemption might read as vague. She rewrote it a second time, more plainly, stating in direct terms that my presence in the home had measurably delayed the need for skilled nursing placement. Citing specific incidents from my care log as evidence, the care log itself became, without my planning it, an enormous document, 3 years of daily entries. Medications given, times, dosages. Falls, near falls, incidents requiring intervention, meals, intake, weight changes. I had started it as a practical tool for myself and the rotating home health aides, never imagining it would eventually sit in a folder in an attorney's office, being read as legal evidence of the value of my life during those years. Proving residency took longer than I expected, mostly because I had spent the first several months still technically listed at my old apartment before the lease officially ended. I had to track down old utility statements, a library card renewal, a doctor's appointment of my own where the intake form listed my father's address, small bureaucratic breadcrumbs that, gathered together, built an unambiguous timeline, and the deed itself required 4 separate meetings with Marguerite Solis, because she was, appropriately, extremely careful to document that my father was fully competent and acting entirely of his own free will at the time of the transfer. She had him evaluated, formally, by a second physician unrelated to Dr. Nanamdi, specifically so that no one ever could later claim he had been pressured or diminished when he signed. I remember that second evaluation vividly. The physician, an older man named Dr. Halloran, asked my father a series of questions designed to establish clear cognitive competence. At one point, he asked my father why he wanted to transfer the house to his daughter specifically. My father, who by that point in his illness sometimes struggled to find words for simpler things, answered this question without a single moment of hesitation. He said, "Because she is the one who stayed." The deed was recorded through the same estate attorney I would later sit across a table from 14 months before my father died. I want you to hold that number, 14 months, because it satisfies the 2-year residency requirement counted from when I had actually moved in, and because it means the transfer happened while my father was fully lucid enough to understand and choose it, which matters enormously for how the law will treat it later. If you have ever done something enormous for someone you loved and had it recast as opportunism by people who were never in the room, stay with me. Subscribe, because the estate table is coming, and it did not go the way any of them expected. Dequicol. 7. The call that brought Aldecol Gap Buldskol, my father died on a Thursday in November, 1142 days after I moved in his own bed, in his own house, with me holding his hand and Wren, to her credit, having driven up for the final week. The 3 of them came for the funeral. It was the first time in nearly 2 years I had been in a room with all 3 of my siblings at once. I want to say that it was warm, briefly, in the specific way that grief sometimes forces a temporary truce. Desmond hugged me and said, "You did so much, Joe, I do not think we understood." I let myself believe for about 3 days that something had actually shifted. It had not. Within a month, the group chat, the one I had been quietly removed from years earlier, was resurrected without me, this time to discuss the estate. 4 months after the funeral, we were called to the office of Marguerite Solis, the estate attorney who had, not coincidentally, also handled the deed transfer 14 months before my fa's death. All 4 of us at one conference table, for what I understood to be a straightforward reading of the will. It was not straightforward. Marguerite opened the meeting by sliding a letter across the table, addressed to the estate, from the state's Medicaid recovery unit. My father, in his final 8 months, had required a brief nursing facility stay after a hospitalization before I was able to bring him home again with additional support. That stay, covered by Medicaid, had generated a claim. The letter stated the state's estate recovery claim against the estate of Salvatore Amaro totaled $214,000 and noted that the estate's primary asset, the house, would need to be evaluated for sale to satisfy it. I watched my sister Priya read that letter, and I watched something close to satisfaction cross her face, and then she said the sentence that I am never going to forget as long as I live. She looked directly at me and said, "Well, I guess 3 years of freeloading finally caught up with you. Nobody gets anything now. Guess that was worth it." Jacob Day 8. What she did not know she was sitting across from Decobalt. I did not raise my voice. I want to be honest that I wanted to. 4 years of exhaustion and erasure had a very specific pressure behind my sternum in that exact second, and I let it sit there for a moment before I spoke. I looked at Marguerite instead of at Priya. I said, "Marguerite, can you explain to my siblings what a Medicaid estate recovery claim can actually attach to, and what it cannot?" Marguerite, who had drafted the deed 14 months before my father's death and clearly understood exactly where this conversation was headed, opened a second folder. She said, "Estate recovery can only attach to assets that are part of the probate estate at the time of death. The house at 214 Larkspur Lane is not part of the estate. It has not been part of the estate for 4 years and 2 months. It was transferred by deed to Josephine Amaro on March the 11th 4 years ago under the Medicaid caregiver child exemption." The room went very quiet. Desmond said, "Wait, when did that happen?" I said, 14 months before Dad died. Dr. Nanamdi told me about the exemption. I have her attestation letter, 3 years of care logs, my proof of residency going back to the month I moved in, and the recorded deed. The house was never Dad's asset to leave you in a will, because he had already given it to me, correctly, legally, while he was alive and competent to do so, specifically so that this exact letter would not be able to touch it. Priya said, and her voice had changed completely, "You did this behind our backs," I said, quietly, because I did not need volume for this part. I did this in front of a licensed attorney, with a doctor's letter, following a federal exemption that exists specifically for people who do what I did. I did not do it behind your backs. I did it because none of you were ever in the room to ask. Wren, who had been quiet the whole meeting, said, "Why did none of us know this exemption existed?" I looked at her, and I said the thing I had been waiting 4 years to say, calmly, without triumph, because there was no triumph in it, only exhaustion finally being allowed to speak. I said, "You 3 have spent your whole careers around Medicaid, long-term care, and hospice policy. I have a marketing degree. I found out about this from a family doctor who happened to be paying attention 14 months before it would have been too late to use it. I am not asking you to explain why none of you told me. I am telling you that the exemption exists precisely because caregiving like mine has value, real, priced, legal value, and the law already recognized that value before any of you were willing to." Marguerite let that sit in the room for a moment before continuing. She said, "For the estate as it now stands, the $214,000 claim will need to be satisfied from the remaining liquid assets. Given the size of the claim relative to the remaining estate, I want to be direct with all 4 of you. There will likely be very little, if anything, remaining to distribute among the beneficiaries once the claim is settled." Desmond asked quietly, "Can we see the paperwork?" Marguerite slid copies across the table. Desmond read his slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked, to my surprise, almost like relief. I did not understand that reaction until later when he told me privately that some part of him had been dreading this exact meeting for months, worried that he would be asked, publicly, to justify why he had done nothing for 3 years while his sister carried all of it alone. My having already solved the outcome, in his mind, meant he was spared having to answer that question in front of everyone. Priya read hers twice. I watched her go back to the first page after finishing, checking the date again, as if rereading it might change what it said. She said, "This is dated 4 years ago. You did this while he was still walking around." I said, "Yes, while he could still choose it, while a second, independent doctor could confirm he understood exactly what he was signing." She said, "And none of us knew." I said, "No, none of you knew, because none of you asked what my days looked like. And I stopped volunteering information 3 years earlier than that, when I understood that volunteering it only ever got me a compliment, and then silence." Nobody was getting the house. Nobody had ever been going to get the house, from the moment my father signed that deed, 14 months before his death. But until that meeting, none of my siblings had known that, and all 3 of them had spent 4 years constructing a story about a sister who had moved in to steal an inheritance that had, in fact, already been legally and permanently placed beyond their reach. for a reason none of them had bothered to ask about. Dakwogult.deli 9. The part that still ash.gelf.dali. Want to give you the honest ending, because I think it matters more than the satisfying one, and because I have found, in the 2 years since that meeting, that the wind did not do what I expected it to do. I did not gloat. I did not need to, and I would not have wanted to even if I had needed it, because underneath everything I said at that table, there was a much older, much sadder truth that the paperwork could not touch. I would have done all 1142 days for free. I want to say that plainly, because I think it is the part that the word freeloader got so completely, viciously wrong. I did not move into that house calculating a future asset. I moved in because my father was dying and needed someone, and I was the one who said yes. The exemption exists precisely because the law understands that. It does not exist to reward scheming. It exists because unpaid family caregiving is real labor with real, documented value, the kind of labor that keeps a fragile person out of a facility that would otherwise cost the state far more, and the law decided, correctly, that labor like that deserves to be protected rather than punished, when the person doing it is not independently wealthy. What aches, even now, is that it took a letter from a government agency for my own siblings to treat those 3 years as real, not my exhaustion. Not the $4,000 in savings I burned through, not the 2 a.m. calls I made alone while they slept in their own beds 3 states away. It took a $214,000 claim and a deed transfer to make the labor visible to the people who should have seen it the entire time, in real time, as it was happening. Desmond apologized properly, a few weeks later, over the phone. He said, "I think we all just needed you to keep doing it, without us having to think about what it cost you. It was easier that way." I believe that is the most honest sentence any of my siblings has said to me in this entire ordeal. He asked, near the end of that call, whether he could see the care log itself, not just the summary Marguerite had referenced. I sent him the digital version, all 3 years of it, and he told me later that he read the entire thing in one sitting, past mutton, and that certain entries, the ones from the hardest stretches in year 2, made him physically sick reading them from 3 states away. Knowing he had been sleeping through the nights those entries described, he said, "I kept telling myself you had it handled. I think what I actually meant was that I needed you to have it handled so I would not have to feel what not handling it would have meant." I do not think that sentence undoes 3 years. I think it is, at minimum, the first time one of my siblings looked directly at what those years actually contained, instead of at the story that had been built around them. Priya has never apologized. We speak perhaps once a year, briefly, at a level of politeness that neither of us tries to push past. I sent her a card when her son graduated last spring. She sent one back when I finally, 18 months later, started a small in-home consulting business, helping other families navigate exactly the paperwork I once had to learn alone. Neither card said much. I think that is simply what is left between us now, and I have made a kind of peace with it. Wren and I have found something closer to real repair. She drove up for the final week, and she has since told me, more than once, that watching those final days up close changed how she understands her own job, and how much she had been quietly protecting herself from feeling, by keeping her professional distance from her own father's decline. I do not think that repair erases the years before it. I think it simply means one of the 3 of them was finally willing to look. She told me something once, about 6 months after the funeral, that I have carried with me since. She said that in her work, she sees families do this exact thing constantly, one sibling absorbing the entire physical and emotional weight of a parent's decline, while the others manage their guilt through distance, through busyness that lets them sound involved without ever being present. She said she had always quietly judged those absent siblings from the safety of her clinical role. Then she said, and then it was my own father, and I found out I was one of them the entire time. I do not know what to do with an admission like that, except to receive it honestly, which I have tried to do. It does not restore the 18 months I went without her help. It does mean that when she calls now, which she does far more often than she used to, I believe the calls are coming from an actual place of reckoning rather than obligation. I still live in the house on Larkspur Lane. I have replaced the hospital bed in the converted dining room with an actual dining table now, oak, seat 6, and Wren has sat at it twice since the funeral, which is twice more than any of my siblings sat at that table, in the 3 years my father was alive. I sit on the porch some evenings and I think about my father, and I think about the $214,000 letter, and I think most of all about Dr. Nanamdi, a woman who was not obligated to tell me anything at all, and who decided, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon 14 months before it would have mattered too late, that somebody should, if you are the one currently providing unpaid care for a parent, and you are not a nurse, and nobody in your medical family has mentioned any of this to you, I want you to hear this clearly. Ask a physician today about the Medicaid caregiver child exemption in your state. Ask about deed timing. Ask while your parent is still able to sign, and get a second, independent evaluation of their competence at the time, so that no one can ever question it later the way my siblings tried to. The law already believes what you are doing has value. You should not have to wait for a letter from the state to make the people around you believe it too. Do it now, while there is still time to ask. That is the entire difference between a story like mine, which ended in protection, and the version of this story that ends the way my siblings once assumed mine would, with the house sold and nothing left for the one who stayed. That is my story. 1,142 days, one deed recorded 14 months early, and a $214,000 letter that finally said, in writing, what none of my family would say to my face. If you have ever given everything and been called a freeloader for it, hear me. The people judging your sacrifice from a distance were never qualified to price it. Only the ones who stayed in the room get to say what it was worth, and I was the only one who stayed. If you are carrying a version of this alone right now, hear this above everything else. Ask the physician about the exemption today, not someday. Someday is how 14 months disappear. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you at the table.